The most recent generation of Roland modules have a feature in the instrument edit section called Transients. This is a pretty powerful tool that can sculpt both how an instrument sounds and how it performs. But what is it actually doing, and how do you effectively use it when you're building your own kit? Let's get to it. Hey, welcome back to the eDrum Workshop. I'm Luke and I hope you're having a great day. In previous installments of how to make Roland drums sound better, I've gone into both pad EQ and instrument layering. If you haven't seen either of those videos, I highly recommend checking them out and I'll put links in the description to both of them. In this episode, we're going to be exploring transients and I'm going to show you how and when to use each of the transient controls to shape your sound. This will apply to the TD07, the TD27 and the TD50 modules. Unfortunately, the TD17 doesn't have the transient options built in, and neither do any of the older modules as far as I'm aware. Does the TM6 Pro? I'm going to start off with a brief technical explanation of generally what each of these settings are doing to the sounds and the waveforms, and I'll make sure to use visual representations in order to keep it easy to follow. So the transient controls change what's known as the attack and the release of a sound, which is effectively the very beginning and subsequent section of the waveform. This is how a recording of a typical snare drum hit is represented visually. You can see a big peak here followed by a tail of smaller peaks. This big one at the start is known as the transient, and different instruments will have different shaped waveforms depending on the character of their sound. A short, sharp sound might have a huge peak and then barely any tail, whereas a subby kick drum like an 808 might have a peak and then a long tail of some quite large waves. The transient controls in the module allow you to manipulate the shape of that waveform. So this will change how the sound is played back, but also quite importantly, it can change how the sound feels when you play it. So the attack control either boosts or lowers that initial peak, the time control is the length of time over which the attack changes, and the release controls the portion after the end of the peak and the remainder of the tail. So if we turn down the attack into the minus territory, you'll get a softer initial hit. This can have a couple of different effects when coming through your headphones. It can make the sound feel less impactful or even a bit further away, or maybe more like the virtual microphone is being held away from the instrument. But on a psychological level as well, it can actually make it feel like the sound isn't quite as responsive as you'd like it to be, whereas when you increase the attack, it will feel more impactful. In the headphones, this will make the sound feel more upfront, immediately responsive, and possibly even sharper, but if you push it too far, it can start feeling really unnatural when you're playing, especially on the lower velocities. And on certain instruments, it will make it sound a bit too brittle or even plasticky and really inauthentic. So exactly how much attack you want to dial in on your instruments will be personal preference of both how you want it to sound and how you want it to feel. Moving on to the release, decreasing this will make the sound decay quicker, but it's not the same as the muffling options. The muffling option effectively deadens the end of the sound, and it will deaden it more quickly as you increase the setting. The transients release settings are a bit more subtle than that, so they can be fine-tuned a bit more or used alongside the muffling options. It affects the waveform a bit earlier on, so it can dip the tail without completely removing it like the muffling does, but at the extremes it can do a very similar job. Increasing the release can make the sound sustain for longer, which is really useful on those sounds that feel like they hit and then drop off really quickly. Or it can also be really helpful when you want the tonal character of a sound to be more emphasized without cranking the EQ. You can then use the gain control to increase or decrease the amplitude of these transient changes. As you can see here, this is how the waveform looks when you've extended the release time with no gain control, and then this is how it looks when you've increased the gain control too. The sound is visibly much louder. You can also use the H&R control to split up the head and rim for independent control of each zone. In certain circumstances, it can be really useful to have different transient controls on the snare head or snare rim, or even on a cymbal bow and a cymbal edge. One thing to keep in mind when you're using the transient features, especially if you go into the extremes, is that it's affecting the beginning of the signal chain, so it will have a knock-on effect for the next steps in the path. So things like the pad EQ or the compression or the master options on the TD27 or the TD50 will be affected. So for example, increasing the attack might make it feel more bright, or increasing the release might add more tone, which means that it might affect your pad EQ. When it comes to compression, I'm going to be doing a future video on the compression settings, but generally speaking, changing up the transients might affect the attack and release time of the compressor. So it's just something to be wary of if you're going to go back and change the transient settings after you've already set your EQ and compression settings. So with all that, what situations might you want to change these controls for? Well, the simplest use might just be adding some smack to your kick or snare to help it cut through the mix. If you feel like you're not getting quite the impact that you want from either of these instruments, even after using the instrument controls for things like head and beta types, increasing the attack could be a quick fix to get a more immediate response from the sounds. Handy uses for reducing the attack would be removing some of that machine gun-like quality from snares or toms, or for softening the attack on certain kinds of cymbals. This could allow you to have smoother rolls across your toms while keeping the body and the tone intact. Or it could help minimize that electronic cymbal-like attack that certain cymbal samples have. I also find the attack controls really useful when I'm layering up instruments. Unfortunately, you can't use the transient settings on user samples, and interestingly on the TD50, certain inbuilt one-shot sounds won't let you edit the transients either, but on the TD27 you can. However, if you're layering a one-shot on top of one of the more dynamic V-drum sounds, you can edit the transients of the Roland sound to help your sample layer sit better. For example, sometimes I'll reduce the attack of a Roland snare if I'm layering a really attack-heavy one-shot acoustic sample on top of it. This can help give the lower dynamics a softer feel in contrast to the one-shot's attack, but it also stops two large peaks from combining into an even bigger peak, which can either mess with your compression settings or just peak the outputs. On the flip side, if the sample that you're using is more for tone, increasing the attack of the Roland sound on the main layer can help tie those two sounds together with a more pronounced peak. One of my favourite uses for increasing the release is to give toms more sustain. Now, you need to be careful not to increase this too much, or it can feel like the sound swells out after the initial hit. But if you like a particular tom sample and you just want it to be a bit more resonant, this can do the trick. It can also give your kick drums more of a tail too. Not all of the built-in kicks have long, bassy sustain, so increasing the release time can help you there. The transient controls can be especially useful on a module like the TD07 for the ride cymbals. There aren't as many controls on that module for things like the pinginess or the wash. I also sometimes boost the release of the ride bow on the TD27 or the TD50 to give it some more wash if I can't get as much as I'd like out of the different settings. If you're still struggling to get your head around it, or you feel like it's too much of a time investment, I've got plenty of pre-built kits on my store over at the eDrumworkshop.com that make plenty of use of the transients and other settings. They take all of the hard work out of getting the balance of the settings right, and they can also be really useful as a reference point to see how each setting is used for use on your own kits. Unfortunately, the TD07 doesn't allow for the import of kit settings, so there aren't any kits available on my store for that module, but there's plenty available for the TD17, TD27, TD50 and even the Pearl Mimic Pro. If you found this video useful at all, please pop a like on it and share it with anybody else that you think might find it useful too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss the next episode of how to make Roland drums sound better, or any other tutorials or eDrum related content. Above all, enjoy the rest of your day and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!